Welcome back! My name is ballerscuba. This is Video Games Over Time. We are still in 1983. Today, we're going to talk about the honorable mentions of 1983. Let's start in the world of computers. In January 1983, Apple released the Apple IIe. The Apple IIe was an upgraded form of the Apple II. The Apple IIe allowed for both uppercase and lowercase letters and came standard with 64 kilobytes of RAM and a M.U.L.E Technology 6502 chip, among other changes. Apple was able to make the Apple IIe at a lower production cost than the original Apple II. The Apple IIe base unit sold for $1,395, over $4,100 in 2022, with a package including the computer, a monitor, a disk drive, and an expansion card allowing for more text on the screen, selling for $1,995, over $5,900 in 2022. The computer would prove to be successful, both among the audience and the critics. On January 19, 1983, Apple released the Apple Lisa. The Apple Lisa was designed to be a high-end business computer, featuring a graphical user interface, a full megabyte of RAM, and a mouse. The Apple Lisa was one of the first personal computers to have a graphical user interface, an element designed to make the computer more accessible. The Lisa came with its own operating system, Lisa OS, designed to combine several programs into a single interface. This included a suite of programs designed around common office tasks, all named after Lisa. The mouse, used to help the user navigate the operating system, was named the Lisa Mouse. Much of these features were inspired by the Xerox Alto, which we briefly mentioned. The Apple Lisa sold for $9,995, just under $30,000 in 2022. Although the critics marked the computer as a notable advancement, the computer would not be able to find a sizable audience. Apple would only sell around 10,000 Apple Lisa computers. This was not enough to make a profit compared to the computer's development cost. In early 1983, Atari released the Atari 1200 XL computer. Under development since 1982, the Atari 1200 XL was designed to be an upgrade to the Atari 400 and 800 computers. Using a modified M.U.L.E Technology 6502 chip, known as SALI, and 64 kilobytes of RAM, the Atari 1200 XL sold for $899, over $2,600 in 2022. This price would prove to be far too high for the 1983 market, and the Atari 1200 XL would be discontinued by June 1983. On May 2, 1983, Microsoft released the Microsoft Mouse. Coming with two buttons, Microsoft's version of the mouse came packaged with a word processor named Microsoft Word, a note-taking software named Notepad, and a tutorial program for using the mouse. This all sold for $195, just under $600 in 2022. While both Apple and Microsoft's version of the mouse would ultimately prove to be very important to the history of computing, at the time, critics criticized the mice as little more than toys. In 1983, the price war between American computer companies continued. In June 1983, Commodore dropped the price of the Commodore 64 to just $300, just under $900 in 2022, although some stores sold the computers for just $199, just under $600 in 2022. Texas Instruments would lower the price of their TI-99 4A computers to just $99 in response, under $300 in 2022, purposefully losing money in hopes of driving their competition out of the market. This did not work, and Texas Instruments would leave the home computer market in October. Atari, not to be outdone, lowered the price of their computers. The Atari 400 and 800 computers' prices were lowered to just $150 and $165 respectively, roughly $450 and $490 in 2022. Atari would also announce upgrades to these computers at the summer CES show. These would be the Atari 600 XL and the Atari 800 XL. These computers would use the same Sally chip as the Atari 1200 XL, but were smaller and cheaper. Although announced in the summer, and although the critics looked favorably on the computers, Atari struggled to get the computers produced in time for 1983's holiday season. In 1983, Tandy discontinued their TRS-80 color computer. Nicknamed the Coco, the TRS-80 color computer was introduced in September 1980 and was primarily designed for business users. This was quickly replaced with the Color Computer 2, a smaller redesigned computer running on a 6809E processor with either 16 kilobytes or 64 kilobytes of RAM. It sold for $159, around $470 in 2022. On June 27, 1983, Microsoft and the ASCII Corporation announced the MSX architecture for computers. This architecture was primarily designed for the Japanese market, where computers still primarily used variants of Microsoft's BASIC interpreter, often variants that were incompatible with each other. The idea behind the MSX architecture was to create an industry standard, with several Japanese manufacturers creating machines using this architecture. The first MSX computers hit the Japanese market on October 21st, 1983. They would be successful, and the MSX architecture would become the standard for computers in Japan. In October 1983, Coleco released the Coleco Atom. The Coleco Atom was designed to be both a home computer and an expansion to the ColecoVision console. The computer ran on a Zilog Z80 microprocessor and came with 80 kilobytes of RAM. It sold for $725, over $2,000 in 2022, coming with the computer, a tape drive, a printer, and a software package. This software package included the game Buck Rogers' Planet of Doom, a port of a 1982 Sega arcade shooter. Despite good reviews from critics at the time, technical problems with the computer caused issues with consumers, and the Coleco Atom was not successful. In 1983, the Osborne 1 was cancelled. One of the earliest examples of a portable computer, the Osborne 1 was able to play a few games, primarily text-based adventures such as Colossal Cave Adventure and Deadline. The Osborne 1 may have been novel when it was released in 1981, but Osborne was unable to compete in the changing computer market of 1983. In 1983, video games made some impact in the world of television. On January 8th and 9th, 1983, an event was held at the Twin Galaxies Intergalactic Scoreboard in Iowa, named the North American Video Game Olympics. 19 players competed against each other in Frogger, Millipede, Joust, Super Pac-Man, and Donkey Kong Jr. This competition was won by Ben Gold of the United States, who is said to be the first video game world champion. This competition was featured in the television show That's Incredible, with the episode airing in February. On September 17, 1983, Saturday's Supercade aired on CBS in America. Saturday's Supercade is a Saturday morning cartoon show produced by Ruby Spears Productions. Ruby Spears Productions was founded in 1977 by former Hanna-Barbera employees Joe Ruby and Ken Spears. The company at the time was most famous for Thundar the Barbarian and the Scooby and Scrappy-Doo Puppy Hour. Saturday Supercade is an animated show featuring segments featuring video game characters. One segment was based on Frogger. In the show, Frogger is a reporter who goes out in search of stories with friends while contending against alligators, cars, and other obstacles. Donkey Kong also had a segment on the show. Donkey Kong escaped from the circus, and it's up to Mario and Pauline to stop him. Typically, Donkey Kong falls in with the wrong crowd and ends up helping them commit crimes, and often Donkey Kong will take Pauline and Mario must rescue her. Pitfall also got a segment on the show. In the show, Pitfall Harry, his niece Rhonda, and a cowardly mountain lion named Quick Claw explore the jungle looking for treasure. Q*bert was also in the show. In the show, Q*bert and several of his friends are in a 50s-inspired city. The segment would feature hopping on blocks, the bubbles with fake swear words, and flying discs from the game. The final segment of the show in 1983 was reserved for Donkey Kong Jr. In the show, after hearing that his father has run away from the circus, Donkey Kong Jr. joins with a greaser named Bones and his motorcycle to go in search of his father. Donkey Kong Jr. has a catchphrase in this show, which is Saturday Supercade did not prove to be as popular as the original video games. However, the show would last 2 seasons, and there will be more segments for us to talk about in 1984. Also starting on September 17th, 1983, CBS began airing a Dungeons & Dragons television series. The show was produced by Marvel Productions, part of the Marvel family of companies most famous for comic books, and D&D Productions, a new company. The animation itself was done by Toei Animation, one of the biggest Japanese animation studios. The Dungeons & Dragons television show follows a group of 6 children who are transported to the world of Dungeons & Dragons. The children must use their newfound powers to find a way home while dealing with the evil Venger, among other obstacles. The show was reviewed well at the time, but the show had some controversy. The violence in the show was seen as too high for a children's show. In 1983, the Pac-Man television show was cancelled. In Season 2, a couple new characters were added to the show. Those were Super Pac from Super Pac-Man and PJ, Pac-Man's cousin, from Junior Pac-Man. Despite these new characters, the show would not be renewed for a 3rd season. Let's turn to some other video games of 1983. In January 1983, Parker Brothers released Star Wars Jedi Arena for the Atari 2600. The first video game to feature lightsabers, 2 players play against each other to use the Seeker Ball to destroy their opponent. The game received mixed reviews from critics and did not sell well. On February 1st, 1983, Activision released Enduro for the Atari 2600. Designed by Larry Miller, Enduro is an endurance racing game. In the game, the player must drive the car passing hundreds of cars through several days and nights. The critics at the time loved the graphics of the game. In February 1983, Williams Electronics released Sinistar to arcades. Designed by Noah Falstein and John Newcomer, Sinistar is a multi-directional shooter. The player must destroy planetoids to collect crystals to create special bombs. These bombs will be used to defeat the Sinistar, a starship with a demonic skull face that is built by the enemies during the game. The game is known not only for its difficulty level, but also for the Sinistar's digitized voice, presented in video game's first stereo sound system. The voice was done by radio personality John Doremus, and says,
I am Sinistar. Beware, I live. Run, run, run. Beware, coward. Run, coward. I hunger.
In February 1983, Atari released Sword Quest Fire World for the Atari 2600. This second entry in the Sword Quest franchise was very similar in design to Earthworld, but with new puzzles for the players to solve. Much like Earthworld, Fire World had a contest held by Atari along with it. Earthworld's contest was held in May 1983. Stephen Bell was able to win the Talisman of Penultimate Truth. The winner of the Fire World contest would receive the Chalice of Light, a goblet made of platinum and gold encrusted with jewels. Atari received 73 correct entries for the contest. Atari then had those players write essays on what they liked about the game. Atari took the players with the 50 best essays and had a competition for them in January 1984. The winner of that competition, and the Chalice of Light, would be Michael Rideout. In March 1983, Konami released Gyruss to arcades. Designed by Yoshiki Okamoto, Gyruss is a tube shooter that is inspired by Galaga. The player flies around a circumference, killing enemies in a quest to head back to Earth from the edge of the solar system. On March 16, 1983, Sega released Astron Belt to Japanese arcades. Astron Belt is a space combat game that combines video footage from a laserdisc with 2D graphics. Astron Belt is the first major laserdisc arcade game. Astron Belt proved to be successful in Japan, but it was not successful in America. On March 25, 1983, Robert Allen Konicki released The Dungeons of Moria to computers. Based on the mines from The Lord of the Rings, this video game has the player delve into a randomly generated dungeon. Heavily inspired by the 1980 video game Rogue, Moria is seen as the first rogue-like game. The player's character is created from a set of races and a set of classes, then the player equips themselves in town before delving deep into a dungeon in search of the big enemy awaiting them at the bottom. In April 1983, Activision released Keystone Capers for the Atari 2600. Developer Gary Kitchen was inspired by the Keystone Cops series of silent films to make this game. Keystone Capers has the player play as a cop who must catch a criminal before the criminal can escape. In June 1983, Enix published the Portopia serial murder case to Japanese computers. Officially named Portopia Renzoku Satsujin Jiken, this video game is a murder mystery game. The player plays as a detective that must travel through Japan collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and solving puzzles. The game was received well in Japan, with critics enjoying the open world, the multiple ways to go about solving the problems, and the game's storyline. On June 24, 1983, Namco released Pole Position 2 to arcades. The sequel to Pole Position 2 added new tracks, different color schemes and billboards, and debris during the car explosions. Despite functioning the same as the original, Pole Position 2 proved to be very popular, becoming the highest-grossing arcade game of 1984 in the United States. It would stay popular for a while, staying among the highest-grossing arcade games in Japan and the United States until 1987. In 1983, M.U.L.E was made available to players worldwide. M.U.L.E, short for Multi-User Dungeon, was originally created in 1978 by University of Essex students Roy Trubshaw and Richard Bartle. Inspired by the dungeon variant of Zork, M.U.L.E is a real-time multiplayer text-based adventure game. The game has the player solve puzzles in rooms in a virtual world alongside other players. The game would be continually developed for years. In 1983, Essex University allowed remote access to their server, and players around the world and the video game press started taking notice. In 1983, Bally Midway released Discs of Tron to arcades. Originally a minigame for the 1982 Tron arcade game, Discs of Tron needed more advanced technology, so the fifth minigame became an arcade game all by itself. The game has Tron and Sark attempting to destroy each other with the discs from the film, attempting to recreate a 3D environment inside the game. In 1983, Micrographic Image released Spelunker to Atari computers. Spelunker is a cave exploration game in which the player must collect items, avoid obstacles and enemies, and make it through the cave without running out of oxygen. In 1983, Epyx released Gateway to Apshai to computers. This prequel to Temple of Apshai is a role-playing game which has the player explore a dungeon. The player must defeat enemies and collect equipment and items while progressing through the dungeon. The player's ultimate goal is to reach the Temple of Apshai, which is explored in the previous game. In 1983, Sega released Star Trek Strategic Operations Simulator to American arcades. Based on the Star Trek franchise, Strategic Operations Simulator is a space combat game. The player controls the Enterprise and must stop the Klingons from invading. The gameplay is heavily inspired by Star Raiders. In 1983, Broderbund released Championship Lode Runner to computers. Developed by Douglas E. Smith, Championship Lode Runner is very similar to the original Lode Runner. However, the levels are more difficult, and the game does not include a level editor, although many of the levels in the game were created using the original game's level editor. In 1983, Parker Brothers released Return of the Jedi: Death Star Battle to the Atari 2600, Atari 5200, and Atari computers. In the game, the player takes control of the Millennium Falcon in the iconic battle from the film. There are 2 stages in the game that vaguely follow the end of the film. This was the first video game based on Return of the Jedi. In 1983, Davidson and Associates released Math Blaster to computers. Math Blaster is an educational video game designed to teach children 1st grade through 6th grade math. The game has the player move a cannon to aim and shoot at the correct answer. The game also features an editor that allows teachers and parents to create their own problems. In 1983, Sierra Online released The Dark Crystal to computers. Officially known as Hi-Res Adventure No. 6, The Dark Crystal, the game was designed by Roberta Williams in a little over a month before she turned it over to artists for the graphics. The game follows the plot of the film in a graphics-based adventure game. In 1983, the Learning Company released Reader Rabbit and the Fabulous Word Factory to computers. Reader Rabbit is an educational video game where the player has 4 activities to choose from. In Sorter, the player chooses words that start with a certain letter. In Labeler, the player chooses letters to spell out the objects on the screen. In Word Train, the player selects a word that differs slightly from the previous word. Finally, in matchup games, the player must match picture cards with their word cards. In 1983, Parker Brothers released James Bond 007 to the Atari 2600, Atari 5200, Atari computers, Commodore 64, and ColecoVision. The game has the player play as James Bond through 4 different levels based on 4 different films in the James Bond franchise. The player must use a multi-purpose vehicle to travel through the level, killing enemies and dodging obstacles to reach their objective. In 1983, ASCII Entertainment released Bokosuka Wars for Japanese computers. Developed by Koji Sumi, Bokosuka Wars is a combination of a strategy game and a role-playing game. In the game, the player leads a formation of warriors across a battlefield. As the warriors fight, they gain experience and levels. As they move forward through the battlefield, more warriors can be recruited. The ultimate goal is to get a powerful enough army to reach the enemy castle and defeat the opposing leader. In 1983, Electronic Arts released M.U.L.E to Atari computers. Designed by Danielle Bunton-Berry of Ozark Softscape, M.U.L.E is a multiplayer strategy game. The players each choose a race, then harvest resources to buy and sell in a game designed around supply and demand economics. The players use laborer units known as mules, multiple-use labor elements. The player's goal is to get as much wealth as possible while keeping the colony alive. The game did not sell well, but the critics at the time loved the gameplay, and the game would gain supporters over the years. In 1983, Strategic Studies Group released Reach for the Stars for the Commodore 64. Designed by Roger Keating and Ian Trout, Reach for the Stars is heavily influenced by the board game Stellar Conquest. The video game has the player control a civilization of a single star. The player must then build an intergalactic empire by exploring, battling, and researching new technologies. In 1983, Coleco released 3 more mini-arcades. Those were versions of Ms. Pac-Man, Donkey Kong Jr., and Zaxxon. These would be the final games in Coleco's mini-arcade line of toys. In July 1983, Namco released Pac-N-Pal to Japanese arcades. Pac-N-Pal is largely inspired by Super Pac-Man and is considered Namco's attempt to fix some of the issues with Super Pac-Man. In this version of the classic maze game, the player must run over playing cards. Those cards will flip over, revealing an item. That item is then unlocked for the player to collect. Items in the game include references to Namco's earlier titles, Galaxian and Rally X. When the player powers up, this Pac-Man can shoot a beam to defeat the enemies. Pac-Man is accompanied by his pal, a green creature with a bow named M.U.L.E, who will attempt to collect items when they are unlocked. The game was only released in Japan and was a commercial failure. On August 13, 1983, Bally Midway released Junior Pac-Man to American arcades. Junior Pac-Man is a maze game, but it scrolls horizontally. The player plays as Junior Pac-Man, who must eat all the dots while avoiding the ghosts Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and Tim. The gameplay is then very similar to the original Pac-Man. The between levels cutscenes in this game show a developing relationship between Junior Pac-Man and a small red ghost named Yum Yum, who is Blinky's daughter. On August 15, 1983, Activision released the Activision Decathlon to the Atari 2600. Developed by David Crane, this game has the player play through the entire decathlon event from the Summer Olympics. This game did come out before Konami's Track and Field, but was not as successful. On September 13, 1983, Williams Electronics released Blaster to arcades. Developed by Eugene Jarvis and Larry DeMar of VidKids, Blaster is a first-person shooter game. It is vaguely based on the universe from Robotron 2084, having the player travel through space, destroying enemies in search of paradise. In September 1983, Atari released Krull for the Atari 2600. Designed by Dave Staugus, the video game follows the plot of the 1983 film. It has 4 different levels, having the player fight slayers, travel through the desert, avoid webs in a spider's lair, then save his bride, who can be used to defeat the beast. On December 5th, 1983, Irem released 10-Yard Fight to arcades. 10-Yard Fight is an American football game. The game replicates a full game, with the player playing offense, defense, and special teams. There are no plays for the player to choose, with each offensive play starting with the same setup. On December 12, 1983, Nintendo released Donkey Kong Jr. Math to the Famicom. Designed by Toshihiko Nakago, Donkey Kong Jr. Math is an educational version of the Donkey Kong Jr. arcade game. There are 2 modes. In Calculate mode, Donkey Kong will hold a number up and the player, controlling Donkey Kong Jr., must move to collect a combination of digits and symbols that will calculate Donkey Kong's number. In exercise mode, the player has to collect digits and symbols to solve fixed equations. The game was a critical and commercial failure. In December 1983, Technosoft released Thunder Force to Japanese computers. Developed by Kotori Yoshimura, Thunder Force is a multi-directional scrolling shooter. The player must shoot airborne enemies and bomb enemies on the ground. Once the player destroys the shield generators in the level, the Dyrodizer will show up, which must be defeated as the level's final boss. Let's turn to some other consoles of 1983. In 1983, Bally Midway discontinued the Bally Astrocade. The Bally Astrocade was originally released in 1977, and although it was seen as a powerful console for the time, the Astrocade never proved to be popular. Including 2 games released in 1983, the Astrocade only saw 28 games released for it. The most popular and recognizable games released for the Astrocade were versions of Galaxian and Space Invaders. On July 15, 1983, Sega released the SG-1000 in Japan. Behind the scenes, Gulf and Western, Sega's parent company, sold its North American arcade manufacturing division, as well as the licensing rights to its games, to Bally Midway. However, the company retained the rights to its Japanese companies, so Sega essentially became a Japan-based company. Sega Enterprises president Hayao Nakayama saw the decline in the arcade market and decided to move the company's efforts to the home market. Hearing that Nintendo was releasing their own console, Sega decided to not only make a home computer, but also a home console. Sega would release the SC3000 and SC3000H MSX computers, as well as the SG-1000 console on July 15, 1983, the same day that the Famicom was released. The SG-1000 was powered by a Zilog Z80 microprocessor and 1 kilobyte of RAM. It sold for 15,000 yen, around $110 in 1983, and around $325 in 2022. When the console was released, there were 12 games available. The most popular of these games would be ports of existing Sega arcade games. By the end of 1983, the console would have 21 games available for it. The most recognizable of these would be a port of Galaga. Sega sold 160,000 consoles by the end of 1983, exceeding their expectations. In October 1983, Casio released the Casio PV-1000 in Japan. The Casio PV-1000 is powered by a Zilog Z80 microprocessor and 2 kilobytes of RAM. It sold for 14,800 yen, just over $100 in 1983, and just under $320 in 2022. Only 13 games were released for the console, including ports of Super Cobra and Dig Dug. The console was not popular, being discontinued within a matter of months. Casio would release an unsuccessful PV-2000 as well, but would focus on releasing computers, including 2 MSX computers in 1983 alone. Let's turn to some of the ports of 1983. This might take a while. In 1983, StarCraft released an enhanced remake of Online Systems' Mystery House in Japan for the PC 6001 and PC 8801 computers. This version tried to be more realistic than the original version, including the depiction of blood. In 1983, Atari ported Battlezone to the Atari 2600 and Apple II. The Atari 2600 version of the game had to change some key details of the game in order for the game to work on the console. The vector graphics had to be replaced with more traditional graphics for the 2600, and the view changed from first person to third person. the Atari 2600 version would sell over 500,000 copies. In 1983, Crystal Castles was ported to both the Atari 2600 and to Apple II computers. These versions, released in the same year as the original arcade cabinet, were ported by Atari themselves. The Atari 2600 version was received well by critics and sold over 700,000 copies. In 1983, Dig Dug was ported to the Atari 2600 and the Atari 5200. Although the original version was designed and published by Namco, the home versions were designed and published by Atari. The Atari 2600 version of the game would be very popular, selling over 1.5 million copies. The Atari 5200 version was not nearly as successful. In 1983, Atari published a port of Galaxian for the Atari 2600. Galaxian was also originally designed and published by Namco. Under the Atari Soft label, Atari also published a port of Galaxian for the ColecoVision and Apple II. The Atari 2600 port proved to be successful, selling over 700,000 copies. In 1983, Atari released ports of Joust for the Atari 2600 and Atari 5200 consoles. Also, Softex Software would port Joust to the ZX Spectrum. The Atari 2600 version would become the most popular, selling over 1 million copies. In 1983, Atari released ports of Jungle Hunt for the Atari 2600, Atari 5200, and Apple II. Atari made some changes to the Taito arcade game for their ports. The hero in these versions is named Sir Dudley, and the girl is Penelope, who is married to Sir Dudley. The Atari 2600 version of Jungle Hunt would sell over 1 million copies. In 1983, Mario Bros. Was ported to several different platforms. Atari saw versions of the game for the Atari 2600 and Atari 5200 consoles. There was also a version released for the Famicom. The Atari 2600 version of the game proved to be very successful, selling over 1.5 million copies. The Famicom version would eventually outdo that, selling a total of over 2 million copies. The Atari 5200 version was significantly less successful. In 1983, Atari ported Moon Patrol to the Atari 2600, Atari 5200, and Apple II. The IREM-developed game would prove successful on the Atari 2600. It would sell over 1 million copies. In 1983, Atari ported Ms. Pac-Man to the Atari 2600, Atari 5200, and Apple II. After the critically disastrous but enormously successful port of Pac-Man in 1982, Ms. Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 was met with tempered success. The game was seen as a better game than Pac-Man on the Atari 2600 and was successful, selling over 1.5 million copies. However, this was nowhere close to Pac-Man on the Atari 2600, which sold over 7.5 million copies. In 1983, Pole Position saw ports released for the Atari 2600, the Atari 5200, and the Vectrex. As a very popular arcade game, it's not surprising to find out that the Atari 2600 version was also popular, selling over 1 million copies. The Atari 5200 and Vectrex versions were not nearly as successful. In 1983, Atari ported Berserk to the Atari 5200. The game had already been ported to the Atari 2600 and the Vectrex, but Atari was able to put the game on their more powerful console in 1983. In 1983, Frogger saw several different ports. A second port for the Atari 2600 was created, named the Official Frogger, for use with the Starpath Supercharger. This was separate from the more popular version released by Parker Brothers. The game was also ported to the Atari 5200, Intellivision, ColecoVision, and computers. None of these versions would be as successful as the Parker Brothers version. In 1983, Kaboom was ported to the Atari 5200. Activision would be in charge of the port, trying to take one of their more successful properties and move it to the more powerful Atari console. In 1983, Miner 2049er was ported to the Atari 2600, the Atari 5200, and the ColecoVision. For the Atari 2600, Tigervision would port the game as 2 cartridges. These were named Miner 2049er and Miner 2049er Volume 2. None of these versions, though, were particularly successful. In 1983, Q*bert was ported to the Atari 2600, Atari 5200, Intellivision, ColecoVision, and computers. Parker Brothers was able to secure the rights to port the game from Gottlieb. The Atari 2600 version was the most popular, selling over 500,000 copies. However, this version received mixed reviews, since many elements from the original game were removed. In 1983, River Raid was ported to the Atari 5200, the Intellivision, and to Atari computers. Activision handled the ports themselves, with Carol Shaw herself handling the ports to the Atari 5200 and Atari computers. In 1983, Atari ported Robotron 2084 to computers and the Atari 5200. Many of these versions of the game had to remove the 2 joystick controls to make the game work on the other platforms. These versions were typically criticized and did not sell well. In 1983, Burger Time was ported to the Atari 2600, Intellivision, and computers. Mattel Electronics bought the rights to port the games from Data East. The Atari 2600 version would be the most successful, selling over 500,000 copies. In 1983, Atari released ports of Pac-Man for the Intellivision and Apple II. After the disaster that was the port of Pac-Man for the Atari 2600, it is no surprise that other ports of the game failed to capture the same audience, although these versions were seen as better games. In 1983, Zaxxon was ported to the Intellivision and the Apple II. Much like the Atari 2600 version of the game, the Intellivision version of Zaxxon removed the isometric perspective of the game in order to make the game work on the platform. In 1983, Donkey Kong was not only ported to the Famicom, which we have already discussed, but also ported to home computers. Atari would handle these computer ports, which would, of course, include the Atari computers. These versions would include the Cement Factory level, which many other versions did not have. The Famicom port of the game would sell over 1 million copies. In 1983, Donkey Kong Jr. was not only ported to the Famicom, which we have already discussed, but also ported to the Atari 2600, Intellivision, and ColecoVision. Coleco was able to secure the rights to port this game as well as the original Donkey Kong. The Atari 2600 version would be popular, selling over 900,000 copies. However, the Famicom would outdo that, selling over 1 million copies. In 1983, Defender was ported to the ColecoVision. Like most ports to the console, the game would not prove as successful as the Atari 2600 version. In 1983, Mr. Do was ported to the Atari 2600 and the ColecoVision. The ColecoVision version made some gameplay changes that on the whole made the game a bit easier. These ports did not prove to be particularly successful. In 1983, Pitfall was ported to the Intellivision console. Activision was able to port the game themselves, though they received criticism for not improving upon the game in the more advanced console. In 1983, Super Cobra was ported to the Atari 2600, Atari 5200, ColecoVision, Intellivision, and to Japanese computers. Most of these ports were done by Parker Brothers. but none of these versions proved to be particularly successful. With the ports now done, let's talk about some major changes at the company level. In 1983, TSR, the company behind Dungeons & Dragons, split into 4 different companies: TSR Incorporated, TSR International, TSR Ventures, and TSR Entertainment Incorporated. TSR Incorporated, headed by Kevin Bloom, would be the main successor to the original company. Gary Gygax would leave the main company to help form TSR Entertainment Incorporated in Hollywood. This quickly became the Dungeons & Dragons Entertainment Corporation. The primary goal of D&D Entertainment was to license Dungeons & Dragons to create movies and television shows based on the franchise. Gygax was largely unsuccessful in his attempts, with the only result of his labors being the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon we discussed previously. In early 1983, Milton Bradley purchased General Consumer Electronics. General Consumer Electronics was the manufacturer of the Vectrex console. That license would pass on to Milton Bradley. One of the first things Milton Bradley did with the license, though, would be to lower the price of the console, in hopes that would save the unsuccessful Vectrex. In 1983, Gottlieb was renamed Millstar Electronics. Gottlieb, the creators of Q*bert, was already a subsidiary of Columbia Pictures. In 1982, Coca-Cola purchased Columbia Pictures and decided the next year to rename their subsidiary. In July 1983, Ray Kassar was fired as CEO of Atari. Kassar had taken over the role in November 1978. During his tenure, Atari had grown exponentially, enjoying some of the greatest success that the video game industry had to offer. Atari sold millions of 2600s. They released major titles such as Adventure, Asteroids, Battlezone, Centipede, Crystal Castles, Millipede, Missile Command, Star Raiders, the Star Wars arcade game, Tempest, and Yar's Revenge. They released hugely successful ports for the Atari 2600 as well. However, not everything went well under Ray Kassar's leadership. Atari had a high turnover rate, including losing the programmers that would create Activision. Atari's computers were mildly successful, but nowhere near expectations. The Atari 5200 proved to be a failure, unable to even come close to the success of its predecessor. Atari had high-profile failures in the E.T. video game, as well as the Pac-Man port. While the successes and the failures are not solely the responsibility of the CEO, the massive losses that Atari was having in 1983 meant that he had to go. In September 1983, James J. Morgan took over as CEO of Atari. Morgan was hired from Philip Morris, the tobacco company, where Morgan had worked since 1963. He was the vice president of Philip Morris when Atari hired him. Let's look at some other stories of the year. In 1983, TSR released Dungeons & Dragons Set 1, Basic Rules, revised by Frank Mentzer. This third version included a player's manual, a Dungeon Master's rulebook, and 6 dice. It also included a solo adventure and an introductory scenario. While the rules themselves were very similar, the way they were packaged was streamlined for younger and newer players. In 1983, DC Comics published DC graphic novel number 1, Star Raiders. Written by Elliot S. Maggin and illustrated by Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, the graphic novel is inspired by the Star Raiders video game. Let's look at the industry as a whole. Overall, the Atari 2600 saw over 200 more games released for it in 1983, of which 32 games were published by Atari. This was the most of any year so far. This doubled the library of the Atari 2600 to over 400 games. The Intellivision saw 47 more games released for it in 1983, including 6 games that required an ECS computer adapter. The ECS computer adapter was Mattel's second attempt to be able to upgrade the Intellivision to function as a home computer. It was rushed to market to appease the FTC's fines at the time. It was not successful. Only 18 of the 47 games in 1983 were published by Mattel themselves. This nearly doubled the number of games available to the console, bringing its total to 104 games. The ColecoVision saw 60 new titles in 1983, bringing its total to 69 games. Keep in mind, though, that with an expansion, all Atari 2600 games could also be played on the ColecoVision. With the expansion, the ColecoVision had a library of roughly 500 games. The Magnavox Odyssey 2 saw 19 games released for it in 1983, including 13 that were released by Magnavox themselves. That means that 6 games were released by third-party developers, the first for the console. This brings the console's total to 66 games. In 1983, Nintendo released 15 additional Game & Watch games, bringing its total to 38. These included 4 Mario games and 3 Donkey Kong games. The most popular of these games would be Mario's Cement Factory in a new widescreen format, which sold over 1 million units. Some new formats this year would include horizontal dual screen, tabletop, and panorama styles. There were 14 new games for the Vectrex in 1983. All of those games were published by General Consumer Electronics or Milton Bradley. This doubled the Vectrex's library to a total of 28 games. The Vectrex was released in Europe and Japan in 1983 as well. Overall, the United States arcade market grossed $2.9 billion, over $8.6 billion in 2022. The United States home market grossed $2 billion, just under $6 billion in 2022. The Japanese home market grossed around 400 million yen, roughly $1.7 billion in 1983 and $5 billion in 2022. Pole Position was the most successful arcade game of the year. Ms. Pac-Man for the Atari 2600 was the best-selling home game of the year. That will do it for the honorable mentions of 1983. My name is ballerscuba. This has been Video Games Over Time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in our next video when we look back at 1983.